Good morning or good evening, everybody, wherever you may be in the world joining us for another United States Study Centre webinar. I'm Simon Jackman, Professor of Political Science here at the University of Sydney and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre and, of course, the US Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. Our premises here stand on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today's webinar, we're delighted to have joining us from Washington, DC, two old friends of mine and of the US Study Centre and of our interlocutor today, Bruce Wolpe. But I'm referring, of course, to Sarah Binder and Tom Mann of the Brookings Institute. And we're delighted to have them joining us. A proper introduction momentarily. But what is our topic today? Well, it's a conversation about the future of US politics in the what we might have once gingerly referred to as the post-Trump era, but indeed, let's call that a hypothesis to be interrogated, perhaps over the next 58 minutes. Look, during the 2020 presidential election campaign, then candidate Joe Biden famously predicted that a loss by Trump in the 2020 election would force Republicans to have, quote, an epiphany and perhaps to turn away from Trump. And indeed, I can remember saying something similar in the weeks after Biden was ultimately declared the winner of the election, that by this time in 2021, there'd be far less focus on Trump as the titular head or the nominal de facto head of the Republican Party, that the fate of one-term presidents is typically to recede into the shadows and allow their party to move forward. President Obama said something similar in 2012 when he said, I believe if we're successful in this, the 2012 election, that the fever may break. And he was referring, of course, to the malaise, as he saw it, of a lurch in a rightward, more authoritarian direction. And remember Obama, of course, saying more like a hot mic moment about how Republicans have been feeding their base crazy for years. That's the fever that Obama was referring to there. But has that in fact occurred, that forecasting by Democratic politicians in particular, Biden and Obama respectively? Can Biden's track record for bipartisanship change the course of polarization that has been a defining characteristic, if you will, of US politics in recent decades? And Biden is one of the most experienced political operators to become president in US history. Is there any chance that he can reverse this trend of deeper and deeper polarization and bring about an era of bipartisanship? And indeed, when we wrote this copy ahead of today's webinar, that seems the more immediate challenge, perhaps uniting his own party around some of his big legislative proposals, let alone reaching across the aisle. And of course, for a US Studies Centre based in Sydney, Australia, the questions that we also want to explore: what are the implications for Australia and Australia's national interests if that internal division inside the United States worsens? To join us today in exploring these questions, we're going to be led by Bruce Wolpe, who I'll hand over to in just a moment. Bruce, of course, a non-resident senior fellow with us here at the US Studies Centre and one of the hardest working political analysts in Australia. You can't miss Bruce across multiple platforms in Australian media. Bruce, of course, though, knows what he's talking about, and that's why he's with us here at the US Studies Centre, of course, having worked politics uniquely, perhaps, worked in politics at high levels in both Australia and the United States. Bruce, of course, working for Democrats in Congress during the Obama presidency, and here in Australia, working to support Prime Minister Julia Gillard, where he served as her chief of staff at one time. And Bruce, enormously valuable member of the US Studies Centre community. He is also, I should say, an author of a University of Michigan Press book that's about to get a second edition describing the inner workings of the US committee system. So no mere talking head, our Bruce Wolpe, an expert with a serious university press book behind him that we'll be talking about in a future webinar. Bruce, of course, brings an extensive network of friends and connections in Washington, D.C. And they overlap with mine from time to time, and today is one of those happy occurrences. Bruce has secured the talents of Sarah Binder and Tom Mann, both through at the Brookings Institute. So Sarah, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, professor of political science at GW, George Washington University, where she specializes in Congress and legislative politics. Her current research explores the historical and contemporary relationship between Congress and the Fed. And she is the co-author with Mark Spindle of The Myth of Independence, How Congress Governs the Federal Reserve, a Princeton University press book from 2017. And for the deep US politics nerds on the call, you may be aware that Sarah is an associate editor of the must-read Monkey Cage blog that is now part of the Washington Post family. A great case study of the academy, political science, finding a voice, talking about issues of the day and finding that nexus between scholarship and more close to real-time relevance and insight. Tom Mann, a frequent visitor to Australia over the years, and of course we'll have to get that renewed when COVID permits, but Tom is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute and resident scholar at the Institute for Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. Tom held the W. Averill Harriman Chair at Brookings between 1991 and 2014 and was the director of the government studies program at Brookings between 1987 and 1999. And before that, Tom had a gig just down the street on New Hampshire Avenue as executive director of the APSA, the American Political Science Association. Great to have Sarah and Tom joining us. Bruce, thank you for organizing today's webinar. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Sarah, Tom, it's just wonderful to have you. Tom, we can't wait till you're back in the country once again and informing and educating us. And Sarah, we want to show you the whole country, top to bottom. Okay, so just as soon as the borders open, you just come on out here and we'll take care. In discussing with Tom and Sarah what we want to do today, the future of American politics, there's a common theme to the discussion, and it is America's democracy working? How serious are the threats to it? What's at stake? What can happen in the short term to ease the corrosive effects and restore some confidence in America's democracy that we see? So we will get there, but we want to go through some issues and political developments. And I want to start with the semi-breaking news on the debt limit, which sort of encapsulates a lot of the underlying fundamental issues. There seems to be an agreement for short-term debt extension, but it was moving up to the edge, Sarah, of a fiscal cliff, and it looked like it couldn't be solved, and there were discussions to solve it or break it. That maybe the filibuster would be visited in the Senate, and it would be used as a wedge to break open the filibuster. But Sarah, the sense that we talked about was that there were some Republicans who were ready to go over the cliff. And I really wanted to get your assessment of the state of play on the debt limit and some of the drivers, particularly among Republicans for it. And Tom, some of the politics that we saw underway as we speak in trying to the short-term resolution, but there's still more to do in December if it goes through. Sarah.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Simon, for including me. So the Senate and Congress and the government itself is caught in this a problem of their own making, which is the U.S. has a limit on how much debt can be issued at any one time. They've hit the debt limit. Treasury Department is looking for coins under the couch cushions to kind of stretch out how long they can pay interest on the debt. Send out checks for Social Security recipients, military, pay employees, federal employees. So everything hinges on this. The U.S. has never defaulted. They've never actually gone over that cliff. And by most estimates, a short-term default and a long-term default could both be cataclysmic for the US as well as the global economy. So the stakes are huge here. But what we saw today, or what seems to be playing out today, is really the Senate Democrats and Republicans are doing probably what they do best in this area of very polarized politics in a Senate that has some very, what I think of as medieval rules that require supermajorities. They basically kicked the can. They looked at the abyss. In this case, the Republicans, I seem to realize that Democrats weren't giving in. I think there was probably a little worry about being blamed because Democratic messaging has been a little more focused to say the problem here is Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, and he needs to get out of the way, Joe Biden, the president, said. I think the Republicans got a little worried about Joe Manchin, the 50th Democratic senator, and whether he might be willing, as Tom will tell us about, maybe to bend the supermajority rules to let the debt limit go through. So I think McConnell got a little nervous. Offered a couple of things to Democrats. They rejected one of them, to use a special budget procedure. They don't want to do that. But Democrats did give in to kick the can, at least until December. So in December, we'll be right back.
Was there sentiment in the Republican Party to be okay for the U.S.? Okay, it's going to default, and guess who's going to wear it? Biden and the Democrats, and there'll be a cataclysm, and they will get hit. Was that a theme inside the Republican Party that you were picking up?
So I think many people have their suspicions that defaulting, perhaps there was some more enthusiasm on the Republican side than meets the eye. So I think that sort of in the realm of speculation. We've had cliffs that the U.S. has gone over before. They haven't been quite as core to the U.S. dollar and treasuries and like the symbol of the American and the world global financial system. The fact that McConnell blinked today about, let's say, a week or two, maybe a couple more before really Treasury really ran out of cash, it sort of suggests to me he's trying to send a message to his colleagues. Actually, we really can't default on go over the cliff on this one.
Okay, Tom.
But yeah.
Tom, what are you thinking?
Well, I think McConnell had a plan. The plan was not just to cause chaos that would come back to haunt Biden and the Democrats, but it was really, I think, to kill the reconciliation Build Back Better package. It was to force Democrats to go through the arduous process of amending their old budget resolutions for the year to allow for a debt ceiling action, and then live through the chaos of potential vote-a-rama, and in the end not be able to get it done. But Democrats sort of dug in their feet. They just said, no, we're not doing it. It's unrealistic. And they said, hey, what are you doing? You said Democrats have to take full responsibility, even though that wasn't the case in past debt ceiling crises. But then you say, but we're going to filibuster you, so you can't do it with your barest of majority party. So I think he had the weak side of the argument, and he really got scared. There are a fair number of Democrats who believed he folded, and it's reinforced for them the view that they really have to play more hardball with him, because Mitch McConnell likes to win and likes to be in the majority, and nothing else really matters to him. And so that's what it's going to be. They haven't settled this, how it's going to be dealt with on December 3rd, but Build Back Better goes forward. And if it's going to pass, it will pass before we return to the debt ceiling.
Yeah, I think that's right. Past debt, I was working on the Hill in the last big debt crisis in 2011. And then at least it was a fight about how much taxing, how much spending, if we're going to extend the debt limit. This was not about that at all. This was just about, I want to stop you cold, and so it was just devoid of any higher policy argument. It was just a
McConnell had no ask whatsoever. And I just to mention one other thing that you had referred to, I think suddenly McConnell felt the uncertainty about the carve out of the filibuster.
Right.
That maybe Manchin and Sinema would go along, because Manchin's words this morning were, he said two things we have to have, and the one that came first was the full faith and credit of the United States and its currency. That can't be left to hurt us. And second, I have a long-standing position on the filibuster, and there's no reason to talk about that. That introduced just enough flexibility, I think, uncertainty, that McConnell got cold feet and said it was time for Plan B.
We'll come back to this, but let's step back for a moment, because to just sort of paint the landscape. I mean, Biden's been president for 250 days, and he had a really strong start. He had good appointees. People known for their excellence and experience, and as diverse a cabinet as ever been assembled. He had the American Rescue Plan. It passed in like the 50th day. He had COVID management, vaccines, great rollout early in the term. The programs have been popular with most Americans, bipartisan deal on infrastructure. But then he hit several walls: Afghanistan, Delta, the border, the uneven economy. And he's on the brink of his legislative agenda. It's not there yet, but it's the whole ballgame as far as I can see. So I'd like to ask both of you to share your thoughts on where Biden is and what his prospects are in general terms right now. And Sarah, why don't we start with you, please?
Sure. So I think just to step back a moment, we are in a period of unified, in this case, Democratic Party control. And what we know historically over the, say, post-war period is unified party control does not last very long. On average, maybe 3-4 years, but in reality, over the last couple of decades, just 2 years before the president's party tends to lose control of the House in the midterms. And everybody knows time is short, and it has increased pressure on the Democrats to move something big, and to use whatever procedures they can to do it without having to encounter a Republican filibuster in the Senate. And I think the problems, as you point out, for the Biden White House I would put them as twofold. First, I do think really Delta is what dealt the biggest blow to the energy and the trajectory on which the Biden was moving. And I think Afghanistan kind of piled on, but that sort of receded, I think, quite a bit from the news. But Delta kicked off more and certainly more shutdowns, more concerns about vaccinations, closures, masking, the whole thing. And so everybody looking forward to the economy improving, we're sorely disappointed. Right, everybody from me and my kids to everybody here to hear on the news. So that has now, maybe we would have had these inflation problems anyway, but the emergence and sort of our economic recovery took a hit, and that has obviously bearing on how people think about the president, especially because that's what Biden ran on, which is to not just restore sanity in the White House, but to take seriously a pandemic and improve and figure out how to marshal all ends of the economy back to work. So I think that was problematic for sure. The other related issue, and again, I wouldn't see this as fault of Biden, but the administration, the first thing they really had to do was really this backwards looking COVID plan, which was to make up for what hadn't been addressed. And it had to be done, I think, and in part, much of it was pushed onto Biden and the Democrats because of a stalemate at the end of the last Congress. But, that's not what you campaign really on. And Delta hits and suddenly, right, the agenda is upset, right? They're no longer in control of the agenda. And few presidents are, but Biden is really struggling. And add on top these really, really slim majorities. And we now have stories about Democrats in disarray and the moderate wing and the progressive wing I think we forget there really is no moderate wing. This is a Democratic Party that has moved to the left. And it looks like a wing because it's such slim majorities. It just takes one or two or a handful. And it's going to take some time. But I think, as Tom was saying, kind of rescuing reconciliation and the package here from the designs of the Republicans over the debt might help the focus their energies on getting to the finish line.
Right. Tom, what's your take here?
Yeah, I think Sarah's spot on. I mean, first of all, the majorities are so narrow. And remember, Democrats really didn't expect to win those, special elections in Georgia, and didn't expect to have a majority. And suddenly they had a unified government, but they had many fewer Democrats in the House than they anticipated. So it's very difficult to get anything done under those circumstances, especially when you're facing a party that finds itself easier to unify when they're in the opposition, in the minority. And Mitch was quicker in announcing that his entire agenda was to kill the Biden agenda. He waited some months before he did that to Barack Obama when he was elected president. And then COVID overwhelms the other considerations. The fact is the economy's doing reasonably well. The public is happy to be out of Afghanistan, but 10 days of saturation coverage of what a moral failure and a cowardice and a disaster was coming from both parties, certainly helped to move his approval ratings down. I think Biden knew when he said that he could build bipartisan agreement in the Senate and the Congress. He knew that was silly, but he, like Obama, both believed it was good electioneering to say you're open to do that. But now he even let it go on a little longer, but I think it's going to be much more hardball. As Sarah said, the Democrats are unified. They have two senators, Sinema, who's Sinema. She's a flake, and she's gone from being a hard green lefty to being enchanted with capitalism and the CEOs that manage it, and doesn't talk to anybody about anything, including in her own state. Manchin, of course, is being Manchin, and he hasn't yet admitted to himself that we have a different reality in American politics and a different Congress. There are no swing senators that you can deal with on matters like this, and that, ironically, the better chance of building any kind of cross-party agreement is by getting rid of the filibuster, not by retaining it.
Yeah, with Simon Jackman's ears, you could say that you can't. It's hard to say Sinema is a flake because Flake was a senator from Arizona too, and so so he's there. I have kind of two observations on the strategic decisions: to go big, go early, go fast. The programs, the program elements, what he wants to accomplish, getting out of Afghanistan. Biden was right, but the execution has been disappointing. And that you had so many high-powered, experienced, capable people, that's the surprise. That France could be so mishandled, that Kabul could be so messy, that that Delta has not. They haven't cracked the Delta nut, as you said, Sarah. And I think that's all hurting because people are not seeing results kind of fast enough. And what you were saying, Tom, when Obama was president, on any vote we took to the House floor, we could lose 39 Democrats and still win.
Yeah.
Today, three. And and you're right, Sarah, as well. When Biden, he has unified the party. I love in the press last week when he said, "I have unified the party. I have 99% of the party behind me. I have two that I need to get," and that's right. So, yeah.
The only thing I just to add is I think it's putting a little too much blame and emphasis on Biden. I actually think it was going to be messy and Afghanistan once you decided to honor the agreement that Trump signed that protected American military still in the country. And if he had not done that, we would have had American service deaths, and we would have had Biden having to increase the military there. And Kabul, that was a disaster. No one anticipated it falling so quickly. And to me, the miracle is airlifting 120,000 people out in 10 days. I think that was just a stunning achievement. So I don't worry so much about him and the quality of his staff.
Okay. Got understood. Absolutely. I want to ask Sarah, to you first, do the Democrats understand that if Biden fails, they fail, and that they are dead in the midterms if this program isn't pulled together? And is that driving them? And then Tom, a little bit more on how the Republicans are positioned right now would be good.
Well, certainly Democratic Party leaders in Congress understand that. And that has really been the message from Speaker Pelosi over the last several weeks, whenever we hear snippets of what's going on in these House Democratic Caucus meetings. She's really laid it on the line in almost increasingly desperate terms. Like at one point she said the Build Back Better was going to be the sort of the pinnacle of her career. I think she's tried to make plain to the progressives that they need to bring that number down, and that going home empty-handed to voters is just not an option. Now, it may be that when we look at the election in hindsight that we say, well, it was all about the economy anyway, but we also know that the president's approval rating tends to matter because these midterms are referendum on the performance of the president's party. To the extent, understanding there aren't very many swing voters left to swing things, and the president's how he's rated will depend on what he accomplishes and what they have to campaign on. They can't blame things on Republicans, even if they believe Republicans to be the cause because of their use of obstruction. Right? All eyes are on the Democrats next year. It's really they have no option but to bring something home to voters.
But ironically, there remain a fair number of Democrats from swing districts, there aren't many, who really believe the reason they got elected is because they had this platform and they said this and they got this distance. I mean, Kirsten Sinema believes that in a Senate race, that it was all her positioning that made the difference. It gives no credit to the extraordinary effort of just one group that registered and turned out 200,000 new votes in the state of Arizona. This is, I mean, it's only at the margin and it's a very slender margin that you can make a difference. Usually you can hurt yourself by doing something really dumb, and it's not a particular vote. I mean, most Americans, even those who are going to vote, don't really have much of a clue of what their individual member is up to, but they take a guess at what she or he is doing based on their party.
Yeah. Let's turn to the Republicans. Tom, you've written so much on the Republicans with Norm Ornstein, E.J. Dionne over many years. And the party is not post-Trump at all. I mean, it's still in his grip. And it seems since the Gingrich days, going back to the time when Gingrich became speaker in the early 1990s, that the party's become more and more extreme. Can you just talk about how you see the Republican Party today?
It's terrifying. The Republican Party was scary pre-Trump. The changes had begun to occur. There was a different coalitional base to the party that came to rely very much on social conservatives and race, and push the effort that Richard Nixon originally made to try to actually use the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts and the progress of the civil rights movement as a way of playing on the really loss of opportunity and jobs and dignity of so many people around the country who had traditionally voted Democratic. So they began to change, but they did it in a way, starting actually in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Government's the problem, and so it was against government, and Grover Norquist, who insisted that all Republican candidates say they will never ever cast the vote to increase taxes, and Newt added to that by all means, but the context was there. The coalition was changing. The party came to embrace pro-life, anti-choice, whatever term you like best, of the abortion issue, and really mobilize the energy and activity of some base voters. There were key organizations that played an important role in this, and it was a lot of very wealthy conservatives got involved in that effort and began building a party. Newt took it and decided the best strategy for the Republicans was to reduce the trust that Americans had in government and the people who populate it and the programs that it passed. And that really opened up this tension between the parties in a way that went well beyond just policy differences. And frankly, we wrote, Norm and I, as you know, wrote a book back in 2012 and said the Republican Party had become the most extreme, not just on individual policies, but on political process and democracy of any Democratic Party in the industrial world. And it just got worse and worse. Climate change, that's just one person's opinion. And they denigrated truth and facts, and they didn't believe in compromise, and they were stirring a base that over time connected with all kinds of other features and developments in our politics. So I frankly think it's closer to a cult, not a tribe. Tribes are small, but a real cult now. And there are many people who honestly believe the only way they can have a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives and a sense of dignity and worthy of respect is finding a leader and being loyal to him. And so this has basically made them eunuchs as a legislative body, checking and balancing a president of their own party. And frankly, it's scary. I think we're close to the abyss. I really think the continued lying about the 2020 election, the attempted self-coup, the efforts underway with social media, building on white supremacist groups, nativists, and so on. It's all real, and people are more open to violence. I mean, we're talking seriously about violence and wondering whether, gee, maybe we'll just have to get out of this country and fight our way out. Now, mind you, this can be hyperbole, but I seem to remember other times in history when seemingly ordinary middle-class, working-class people who had never done a thing in politics before got really excited about the possibilities of someone speaking up for our country and what it means. And it's not a happy history to repeat here in the US.
It's quite sobering, so Sarah, turning to you, do you see strands inside the Republican Party? You know, in the old days, Republicans, Democrats like to work with each other. And so given this overlay of what is occurring there underneath, are there other forces that could over time bring the Republican Party back into something that that is a little more workable as far as more bipartisanship, more agreement on a common direction for the country?
I'm highly skeptical so long as Trump is in position as the leader of Republicans, that even to the extent we know there are some Republicans who disagree with him, especially elected Republicans in Congress who may disagree with him, they're too seemingly terrified to speak up about it. And I think sometimes we lose sight, even in Washington, about what exactly that January 6th insurrection really did to relationships in Congress, right? We're used to the two parties not kind of trusting each other on policy, but it's much deeper than the distrust runs really from Democrats distrusting Republicans to keep everybody safe. I mean, there's just like this, I think, traumatic outcome from that insurrection, and it has really rendered the bipartisan relationships that were there on local issues, on parochial issues that were working below the surface, even those have been disrupted, and many of them. And so I'm skeptical so long as Trump is in the picture. I think he absorbs and soaks up all the oxygen, and he revs up this cultural grievance, right? Not even so much the left-right lines, but this sort of cultural social grievance. And it's connected to him as his personal loyalty. It really leaves no room, I don't think, for those types of working relationships. Now, having said that, we often overestimate deadlock in Congress. And many political science are trying to kind of show the ways in which there is more bipartisan things that do happen. And there's some truth to that. But at the end of the day, you and I can all point to the big issues of the day that are just stuck on the agenda, right? And so, yes, opioids have been addressed to a large degree. There's a landmark land conservation bill in the last Congress. There are these efforts, these bipartisan efforts that do emerge. But when I look at the big issues, the future of entitlements, climate change, immigration, they just pile up, and these issues don't go away. And they don't go away because there doesn't seem to be any willingness to meet the other side, right? I don't expect them to meet in the middle, right? Because there is no middle in American politics, but we do need them to come to the table and to know what the other side wants, so you can have some sort of, like, not zero sum, but positive sum, right? You get your preferred outcome, I get mine, and suddenly we do something bigger. But those deals aren't happening. They're really not happening.
Can we drill down to a couple of the drivers of that, that bring us to this place, and which is the long-term threats to America's democracy? And I think there are two that are really top most in my mind: obstacles to the right to vote and the corrosion of faith in the integrity of elections. And just any thoughts on those, which are still ever present? Yeah, Republican states, Georgia and Arizona, who are changing their election laws to become more restrictive, even though the Republicans went to every length in that state to certify and properly did an election. That's not good enough. We got to do more.
Bruce, it's really stunning what's happened. I mean, one of the biggest developments in our politics is that we now have minority rule. That is, we have a bias in the structure of the system combined with the nature of the party system now. So geography intersects with general political predispositions. The Senate is an embarrassment in the world of democratic legislatures. 2 per state. I mean, and it's hardwired in the Constitution. Can't even pass it with the normal constitutional amendment. Now, Democrats used to do pretty well in some lightly populated states. There's still a few like that remaining, like Vermont. But the bias now in the rural areas, and in particular in the industrial states, together with that, really favors the Republican Party. Estimates are that in less than 20 years, you could have 70% of the population living in 15 states. earning them 30 out of 100 senators, and the 30, the 30% of the rest of the population has 70 senators. I mean, the Senate in the future faced the crisis of legitimacy, and then that contributes to the electoral college problems. Republicans don't win majorities or pluralities easily in presidential elections or in House and Senate elections. It's because Democrats cluster in urban areas and states and waste votes and seats in both the Senate and the House, and the electoral college adds to it, and then the Supreme Court, which is now a 6-3 majority appointed by Republican presidents. They didn't have that many Republican presidents. Trump got 3. Thanks to Mitch McConnell. He plays hardball. He plays to win, to appoint judges and get them confirmed. And it's a huge problem, because while now the sort of violence and unhappiness is on the right, you could imagine it developing on the left as democracy is really diminished, if not crushed absolutely. I mean, you could see not just are some votes suppressed, but votes are ignored, overturned by state legislatures. We have funny laws and constitutional provisions that make it very vulnerable, and Republicans will almost certainly again control another majority of states, which gives it the ability to appoint its own president, whatever has happened, if it falls to them. So we are in real trouble, Bruce. I just think it's a mistake. Yes, congrats to all those people, the judges, the officials, the bureaucrats, the activists who kept the election from being stolen in 2020. But Trump thinks that was just a dress rehearsal. And now the activities going on in the states, as you referred to, passing laws that really make sure a minority elects this next set of leaders. And the only way to stop it is by dumping the filibuster, or at least reforming it to exclude voting rights and the like. And that we may come to that. I still think there's a chance in September, when the reconciliation bill is presumably resolved, that we'll come to that, and the pressure on Manchin and Sinema will be enormous to do this. And frankly, I think it's necessary, though far from sufficient step for saving our democracy.
Sarah, one more question to you on this, then Simon, over to you for questions from our friends who are listening. And that is, so don't we really have to, isn't voting rights then is really there are these structural issues baked into the Constitution, impossible to change in the near future. So voting rights and is the ultimate check here, correct? And is my view is next year, even on the midterms, it's almost going to be a holy march to the polls by people to vote, and that they will stand in line for 7 hours and no one can give them food and water. And it will be a spiritual journey because people understand what's at stake.
Well, so there are 2 areas, I think, of concern to folks who study elections and the fairness of elections. First, as you said, is the Voting Rights Act. and the efforts in states to really pare them back, to put it mildly. The second is the law under which electoral college votes are counted for the president. And there's a mess of a law called the Electoral Count Act. And there are many suggestions and reforms for how to close off the ambiguities that were not exploited successfully in 2020, but could be exploited successfully. But none of those are going anywhere because it demands action at the federal level, and Republicans are not going to participate in those reforms as best anybody can tell. Possibly something on the Electoral Count Act if they can be convinced that there's something in it for them, but I'm somewhat skeptical. So everything then is back to turnout, back to your original question about whether or not, from the Democrats' perspective, enough people will turn out in these places where voters of color have lost much of their voting rights. I think the question in part is, can Democrats motivate their partisans to turn out if there's no Trump and no Trump policies on the ballot? It worked quite well in 2018 for generating a lot of women candidates, a lot of very well-funded candidates to take back control of the House. And it worked in 2020 clearly in those Senate races, particularly in Georgia with Stacey Abrams in particular. I think that's kind of in a world where there's, as we talked about, so few swing voters, much of everything's about turnout. And the question is, are there hidden Democratic voters on the left that Trump was able to generate his hidden conservative voters on the right?
Yeah.
I think we don't really know yet.
And will the Trump voters turn out without Trump on the ballot too? That's an interesting thing. Anyway, Simon, some questions from all of our friends.
There's a rookie error from putting myself on mute on webinar number 700. But anyway, hey, it's been a fabulous conversation. Let me just say that, and the depth of the insight Tom and Sarah have been providing over these last 3/4 of an hour. Just thank you so much in advance. Let me move to some questions that have come up, ahead of time, but also in real time. Look, let's knock this one out first, because it's something we get a lot in Australian media, and these are questions about Biden himself. And I just, maybe briefly, we can just get this out of the way, and that is he enfeebled, frankly, as some media reports point out? The White House has got very tight control over messaging and comms and whatnot, and it seems to be a staple, particularly in media predisposed not to be sympathetic to the Democratic side, to really go at that as a characteristic. I'm wondering your assessment of that, the reality of it, and the politics of it. Sarah, perhaps you first. Sorry, Tom.
No.
I'll be curious what Tom says. I would put it this way: is, well, every comparison to the Trump White House is interesting, but in comparison to the Trump White House, there really have been, I would almost say, no leaks about what is going on in the White House, and it really does appear to be a well-oiled machine, as it were. And I don't think that's because there's such a tight lip we don't hear. I do think given the traumas in the world, I do think it is a pretty well-functioning White House, despite the missteps and problems that Bruce started us off with. So I think I'm not worried about Biden's mental health. So long as decisions are being made, he's up on the hill, he's speaking, he's talking, and he's traveling, and he's speaking sense. It's not really something that other things keep me up at night, and that's not it.
An emphatic no.
Okay. We'll leave it at that. Look, I want to come back to Joe to Manchin. And I want to probe both of you on Australians. Not many Australians might know what the Hyde Amendment is. And could you explain to us what the Hyde Amendment is, number one? Number two, what role might it play in, is that a bridge too far for the progressive wing, which is a wing of the Democratic caucus, if that is the something that Manchin is insisting on? So again, perhaps Sarah, for an Australian audience, explain to us what the Hyde Amendment is and why Joe Manchin wants it. Or does
sure.
it?
So at its most basic, right, the Hyde Amendment, it's been written into laws and kept there since the 1970s, barring the use of federal funds to pay for abortion, except to save the life of the woman, or in the cases of incest, pregnancy that arises from incest or rape. And it has been embedded in laws, and it has stayed there, and it affects a number of federal programs. And it doesn't affect state spending, but it does affect federal programs. So the issue it's come back on in the sort of news stream of late is that the House Democrats, in passing the spending bills that they have, at least through committee, I'm not sure how many are through the floor, have taken out the Hyde Amendment from the pivotal, what we call the labor health, and the spending bill that deals with health programs. I think there's skepticism that Democrats in the House will succeed in keeping it out because it does have to contend, obviously, with the Senate, and spending bills need supermajority votes. So I think that's part of what Senator Manchin was signaling this week when he had said something about favoring the Hyde Amendment. I think it's just those spending bills also kick the can until December. They'll need to address that at some point. I'm a little skeptical that the House Democrats will succeed in that pursuit of stripping it out of the law.
Simon, that was the issue generally of funding for abortions. That was the last piece of nailing down the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare, and it took elaborate negotiations to figure out ways of setting up sort of separate accounts and funds. And in the end, it helped to that there was a little more margin for acting. But basically, it's that's something they'll probably have to give up. Frankly, with the Supreme Court teeing up a major case deciding Roe versus Wade, and likely we'll see. We don't know what they'll do. I know what John Roberts would do if he still could control a 5-4 majority, but I don't know now. But frankly, that will tend to overwhelm that issue, and you'll see where in states where abortions are legal, there'll be 15 to 20 of those states. They already have some public funds going for abortions, and they will be there, but the disaster will be for poor women in the remaining 30 plus states.
Let's take a question from the audience, and Timothy Lawler, I think, gets us back to one of the framing questions that I kicked us off with, and that is, bottom line, what does it take for the Republican Party to do what Obama said it would do after 2 losses, and again, what Biden said he thought it would do after he defeated Trump? What would it take for the Republican Party to sort of kick clear of, sort of, we call it Trump, but as the discussion indicated earlier, I think Trump might be as much symptom or standard bearer of sort of a trajectory that's perhaps been underway. What would it finally take in both, in your assessment, each of you, perhaps again, the order we've been running? Sarah, perhaps you first.
Sure. So when we look sort of historically at like how do you generate real change in the American political system, it's typically some shock, right? Whether it's war, most often, other types of crises, immigration. But what we're seeing is the type of crises we encounter don't seem to be shaking loose the system. And so as sort of a second best, I've always said, well, shy of World War, hopefully, unified party control, some electoral movement that generates more power for one party, for better or for worse, than the other party. But until we're, as we can see from this round of unified party control, with slim majorities, you're really not getting the bang for the boost, which is, from my book, the goal is to really kind of solve problems. And we're not generating those types of electoral currents that are really going to shake up the system yet. Now, nothing is forever in American politics,
Right.
but it's sometimes really hard to move the ship of state. Right? It's really hard to move the direction. Trump is something that seems to be made some changes here, but I'm hard pressed to say in the short term, how do you get out, as Obama would say, to kind of break the partisan fever? I think the challenge is learning to legislate in these very, very polarized times.
Republicans, through their national committee, actually commissioned a study of what they should do after Obama was reelected, and it took advantage of all of the demographers' forecasts of the changing composition of the American electorate and the decline of whites and the rise of minorities and young people and educated people, and so this report urged them to actually try to build support instead of in some of these communities, and divide the group and their support and give you more room. But then developments occurred, and Donald Trump came along, and he took the advice that, no, we don't have to do that. The hell with them. There are more white people out there who aren't voting Republican, and let's go for them. And he did that, and as a result, we see more and more hardening around the country. It's not just red states and blue states. It's urban areas and rural, and it's certain kind of suburbs versus other kinds. People are living in like-minded places, and now everything is so hardwired. We used to have a fair number of senators, Sarah, sometimes 22, who would be elected from states that voted for a presidential candidate of the other party. Now there are almost none, each, and the same is true in the Senate. It's impossible. Each party won 25 seats in the presidential race, and that party that won holds 47 seats, each of them in the Senate. It's so tied together that until the coalitional base of the party changes, and it'll take something big. And like Sarah, I thought no one wants one party government, but for a half dozen years, you could actually solve some problems and maybe have a Lincoln-like replacement of a Republican Party with one that's more suited for the future composition of the country. But for the time being, Donald Trump and many Republicans believe they can win with their minorities.
Right. Look, that takes us exactly to the top of the hour. We've got so many great questions there. We'll have to, I think, do this again, as they say, and work through some of those questions. In particular, just to foreshadow some of these questions about foreign policy, thinking, putting our US Study Center hat on, and is foreign policy and strategic competition with China, defense spending, might that sit in the small bucket of things that do have bipartisan support that Sarah was perhaps alluding to earlier? That will have to be a conversation for another day. But the good news is these issues aren't going away anytime soon, and nor is the US Study Center. So we'll have an opportunity to visit again, I hope, with Tom and Sarah, either in person or perhaps more realistically online in due course for another go around at these questions. Thank you to both of you for joining us in the evening there in Washington, DC. I so appreciate it. And truly the insight and the depth of insight the two of you have, your long careers of studying US politics at a level of granularity and expertise that is so valuable to the US Study Center and our stakeholders and our audience today. So thank you. And Bruce, always thank you for all you do for us at the US Study Center.
I'll close on a bipartisan note. We can all agree on attacking Facebook, right? So that's okay. Republicans are out there. They're coming for you. So watch out.
I do want to tease that next Friday, with Ambassador Jane Hardy, David Santoro from Pacific Forum in Honolulu, and of course, Ambassador Jane Hardy, Australia's most senior civilian representative there in Honolulu with Indo-Pacific Command, and our own Ash Townsend, the director of our Foreign Policy and Defense Program. Next Friday, integrated deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, advancing the Australia-United States alliance, back onto security matters front and center, and in that conversation that Ash will be leading next Friday. Please join us for that one. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you on another webinar.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Thank you.